For 40 years, a killer breathed paradise air while a 15-year-old girl remained forever frozen at a bus stop. Gary Ramirez watched Pacific sunsets from his home in Maui, Hawaii. He felt ocean breezes against his skin. He lived completely, utterly free, while 3,000 miles away in California, cardboard evidence boxes gathered dust in windowless storage rooms, and a family aged with grief they couldn't bury. In 1982, Karen Stitt trusted something simple: the number 22 bus schedule on El Camino Real in Sunnyvale, California. She was a spunky East Coast transplant with feathered blonde hair and a smile that lit up rooms, just months into her new California life, still learning the routes, still figuring out this sprawling Bay Area world so different from Pittsburgh. On the night of September 2nd, her boyfriend walked her to that bus stop near the corner of South Wolf Road around midnight, then left her there alone under flickering streetlights, worried about making his own curfew. She wore his Rush baseball cap. She never made it home. By dawn on September 3rd, a delivery driver would find her nude body hidden at the base of a cinder block retaining wall near the now defunct Woolworth Garden Center, just 100 yards from where she'd stood waiting. 59 stab wounds, wrists bound with her own shirt, and blood on that wall. Blood that held 2 DNA profiles, victim and killer mixed together in a silent accusation that 1982 technology couldn't read. The case went cold, leads evaporated. Investigators retired. Karen's family counted birthdays she'd never see, marked anniversaries of a murder no one could solve. Meanwhile, Gary Ramirez, a complete stranger who'd seen an opportunity in a teenage girl alone after midnight, moved to Hawaii and disappeared into tropical anonymity. 40 years. 14,600 days. Evidence preserved but useless. A killer living free in paradise while justice gathered dust. Until 2022, when Detective Matthew Hutchison, the kind of stubborn investigator who treats cold cases like personal debts, received a tip about a family name. A collaboration with a genetic genealogy expert followed, and then came the most mundane breakthrough imaginable: a single piece of trash from a daughter's garbage can in Southern California. That discarded trash held DNA. That DNA pointed to a father, and that father had been hiding in plain sight for 4 decades, believing time had buried his crime as thoroughly as Karen's sister would later scatter her ashes over Mount Tamalpais. This is the story of Karen Stitt, a girl who deserved to grow up. And this is why we never ever stop investigating. Welcome to Solved Cold Cases HQ. If you believe in the relentless pursuit of justice, even decades after a crime, please subscribe and turn on notifications right now so you never miss these important stories. Then hit that like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on genetic genealogy and cold case investigations. Because this case proves that truth waits as long as it must, and we never give up on the missing and murdered. Let's begin. Karen Stitt had feathered blonde hair that caught the California sunlight differently than it had caught Pittsburgh gray. Lighter, almost golden when she stood in the right spot. At 15, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd already navigated one major life transition and figured she could handle anything else thrown her way. When she spoke, there was something distinctly East Coast in her cadence. Not quite an accent, but a rhythm that marked her as not from here. A verbal fingerprint of her Pennsylvania roots that made people smile when they heard it. She was a student at Palo Alto High School, though student feels too generic for what Karen actually was in those early fall months of 1982. She was a transplant in the truest sense, uprooted from everything familiar just months earlier and replanted in Bay Area soil, actively working to grow new roots. She studied bus schedules the way other teenagers studied for tests, memorizing route numbers and transfer points, claiming independence through public transportation. The number 22 bus wasn't just how she got around. It was proof she belonged here now. Proof she could navigate this sprawling California world without asking for help. Karen is the kind of person who figures things out. When her family split, Father and siblings heading west to Palo Alto, mother remaining in Pittsburgh, she didn't crumble. She adapted. She learned which buses connected her father's house to her boyfriend's neighborhood in Sunnyvale. She mapped her new teenage geography through trial and error, getting off at wrong stops and finding her way back, building confidence with each successful journey. She is the kind of person whose smile gets mentioned by everyone. Decades later, when Aunt Robin Stitt Morris talks about her niece, the first thing she remembers is that smile, how it could light up rooms, how it was genuine and warm, not the practiced smile some teenagers deploy, but something real that made people feel included. In yearbook photos and family snapshots, that smile is consistent, bright, open, welcoming. She is the kind of person who turns ordinary moments into small adventures. Playing video games at the 7-Eleven with her 17-year-old boyfriend wasn't just killing time. It was their ritual, their spot, their version of romance. She wore his Rush baseball cap with the rock band insignia like it meant something, because it did. It meant belonging, connection, being someone's person. She made miniature golf at Golfland feel significant. She could transform a Tuesday night into a memory. Her family structure was complicated in the way many 1980s families were becoming complicated, but Karen navigated it with remarkable grace. Father Robert Stitt was her primary guardian in Palo Alto. He'd brought her and her brother west, while Mother Catherine Leszewski remained in Pittsburgh. It was a fracture, a split, the kind of parental separation that destroys some kids. But Karen stayed close to everyone. Her older sister Suzanne was protective, the kind of big sister who paid attention, who would later choose a beautiful mountain to scatter Karen's ashes because she knew her little sister deserved beauty. Her brother, name lost to time but presence felt, lived with them in Palo Alto, sharing that household of East Coast transplants trying to become Californians. Aunt Robin Stitt Morris, watching from extended family distance, saw Karen as a vibrant soul, someone special even among the people who knew her best. Karen's daily life had rhythm. Morning, Palo Alto High School, navigating hallways and trying to make friends when you're the new girl with the almost accent. Afternoon, homework probably, the grinding requirements of sophomore year. Evening, often the bus ride to Sunnyvale to see her boyfriend, to claim teenage independence and romance in equal measure. She'd meet him at the 7-Eleven on El Camino Real before 9 p.m., their spot, their starting point. They'd play video games with quarters warmed in their pockets, then walk to Golfland for miniature golf under artificial lights, then to Ponderosa Elementary School, where they'd sit and talk about things 15 and 17-year-olds talk about when they're away from parents and rules. She loved that routine. She was building it, week by week, establishing herself not just as Karen from Pittsburgh, but as Karen who lives here now. She was becoming a Bay Area teenager, learning the culture, adopting the casual California confidence that felt so different from East Coast intensity. Her dreams weren't grandiose. They were practical and immediate. Finish settling in at Palo Alto High. Make real friends, not just acquaintances. Maybe join a club or activity. Keep seeing her boyfriend. Figure out this California life. Eventually graduate, maybe go to college, maybe stay in the Bay Area because by then it would feel like home. She had time for all of it. She was 15. Time was something she assumed she had in abundance. What made Karen memorable wasn't one big thing. It was the accumulation of small things. The way she'd figured out bus routes in a new city without complaining, the warmth of that smile everyone remembered, the adaptability she showed after a cross-country move and parental separation, the confidence to take public transportation alone at night because she trusted the schedules, trusted the system, trusted that the world was generally safe for a girl who followed the rules and caught the right bus home. She was only months into her California transformation when September 2, 1982 arrived. She was still becoming. Still figuring it out, still building the life she'd lived for decades. She was supposed to have decades. Thursday, September 2, 1982. Late summer in the Bay Area. The kind of mild California evening that makes people forget danger exists, when the temperature hovers in the comfortable 60s and the air smells faintly of eucalyptus and car exhaust. Before 9 p.m., Karen Stitt boards a local bus in Palo Alto, wearing a leather jacket over a striped shirt, pants, and her boyfriend's Rush baseball cap, the one with the rock band insignia he'd let her borrow. She knows this route now. She's taken it before. The number 22 connects her world to his world, her father's house to her boyfriend's neighborhood in Sunnyvale. Independence through memorized schedules. 8:50 p.m., she arrives at the 7-Eleven on El Camino Real in Sunnyvale. Her 17-year-old boyfriend is already there, waiting like he always waits. They feed quarters into video game machines, the electronic beeps and bloops providing soundtrack to teenage romance. Fluorescent lights overhead. The smell of convenience store coffee and floor cleaner. Normal, completely, utterly normal. 9:15 p.m., they leave the 7-Eleven and walk to Golfland, the miniature golf course where windmills turn and artificial waterfalls create ambient noise. They play under lights, keeping score or not keeping score, just being together in that specific way teenagers are together when they're navigating what together means. 10:30 p.m., they walk to Ponderosa Elementary School. Sit on playground equipment designed for children much younger than them. Talk about things that matter and things that don't. The night air cools slightly. Somewhere, Karen's father expects her home eventually. Somewhere, the boyfriend's parents expect him home by curfew. Time passes the way it does when you're 15 and 17, and the world feels simultaneously infinite and immediate. 12:30 a.m., early morning, September 3rd. The boyfriend walks Karen to the bus stop at the corner of El Camino Real and South Wolf Road. The commercial corridor that bustled 12 hours earlier now stretches empty. Isolated pools of streetlight connected by shadows. Occasional cars pass. The bus stop sits near the Woolworth Garden Center, closed and dark. He would later tell police, "I felt bad about leaving her alone, but I didn't want to get in trouble with my parents for being home late." He walks away. She stands there alone, feathered blonde hair catching streetlight, wearing his baseball cap, trusting the schedule, trusting the system, trusting that following the rules keeps you safe. 12:30, 12:45 a.m. This is the window. This is when everything changes. A machinist working the late shift at a nearby facility notices something unusual. A white panel truck, old-fashioned design, with a distinctive stripe along its side and a rectangular bumper sticker on the rear. Parking lights on, engine running or recently shut off, parked near where the bus stop sits. He makes mental note. It's out of place, slightly wrong, but not wrong enough to call police. Not yet. Later, this observation would haunt him. 12:50 a.m., estimated. The number 22 bus makes its scheduled stop at El Camino Real and South Wolf Road. The driver slows, looks for passengers. The stop is empty. No teenage girl in a leather jacket and baseball cap, no one waiting. He continues his route. This happens sometimes. People catch earlier buses, get rides, change plans. The empty stop doesn't register as emergency, not yet. 1 a.m. Robert Stitt expects his daughter home soon. Not exactly at 1, but soon. Buses run on schedules, but life runs on approximations. He's not worried yet. Not yet. 2 a.m. Now he's worried. Calls begin, tentative at first, then urgent. The boyfriend's house, friends, anyone who might know where Karen is. The boyfriend confirms he left her at the bus stop at 12:30. She was supposed to catch the bus home. She was supposed to be safe. 2:30 a.m. Robert Stitt calls Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety. His 15-year-old daughter didn't come home. She was last seen at a bus stop on El Camino Real. She knows the routes. She's responsible. Something is wrong. Dawn, September 3rd. Investigators begin checking the area around the bus stop. El Camino Real in early morning light looks different than it did at midnight. Commercial, mundane, safe. They search. They find nothing. Karen Stitt has vanished from a busy roadway in a populated area. No witnesses. No evidence. No Karen. 10:45 a.m. A delivery truck driver makes his regular rounds to the Woolworth Garden Center on El Camino Real. He's done this route 1,000 times. Knows the loading area, the retaining wall, the cinder block structure behind the building. As he approaches, something catches his eye at the base of the wall, approximately 100 yards from the bus stop where Karen stood alone at 12:30 a.m. He sees skin first, pale against gray cinder block. Then he sees everything else. Karen's nude body lies hidden at the base of the retaining wall. Her wrists are bound behind her back, not with rope, not with zip ties, but with her own striped shirt, the one she wore under the leather jacket. Her jacket is tied around her left ankle in a grotesque parody of constraint. Personal items, makeup, small belongings, are scattered around her like a perverse constellation. Leaves and dirt near her feet are disturbed, churned up, evidence of movement and struggle. She was alive when brought here. She fought. Blood stains the cinder block wall behind and above her body. Not spatter, but contact staining, substantial amounts. 2 DNA profiles would eventually be extracted from that blood. Hers and someone else's. The killer's. Mixed together in accusation. The delivery driver's hands shake as he reaches for his radio. His voice breaks when he speaks to dispatch. The words come out wrong at first, tangled, because the human brain resists processing what his eyes are seeing. 11 a.m. First responders arrive. Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety, investigators, the medical examiner. They photograph, they document, they count wounds. 59 stab wounds to the neck, chest, abdomen, and back. 59 separate strikes delivered with enough force to penetrate clothing, skin, muscle, organs. This wasn't killing. This was obliteration. This was rage made physical. The medical examiner determines cause of death. Stab wounds to the chest and neck. But everyone standing at that scene knows the cause goes deeper than forensic terminology. This was evil, selecting a target at random. This was a 15-year-old girl who trusted a bus schedule and paid for that trust with 59 stab wounds. Detective Matt Hutchison, who would inherit this case decades later, would describe it as the most graphic and violent scene that I've seen in my career as a police officer and firefighter. Seasoned investigators who'd worked homicides for years stood at that retaining wall and felt something different. This wasn't domestic violence where anger has a target and history. This wasn't robbery gone wrong where killing serves a purpose. This was predatory violence for its own sake. This was someone who saw an opportunity, a teenage girl alone after midnight, and took it. What was left behind? An empty bus stop where Karen should have been picked up. A baseball cap with a Rush insignia lying near the retaining wall. The boyfriend's cap, the one she'd borrowed, now evidence. A father's house in Palo Alto with a bedroom that would never be slept in again. A leather jacket that would spend decades in an evidence box, waiting for technology to read the story written in blood and body fluids. A life that was supposed to unfold over decades, compressed into 15 years, and ended at the base of a cinder block wall 100 yards from where she stood trusting the schedule. In September 1982, when investigators collected blood from that cinder block wall, they were preserving evidence for a future they couldn't imagine. DNA fingerprinting, the technique that would eventually solve this case, wasn't even publicly available until 1984, 2 years after Karen's murder. The Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety had competent investigators, proper evidence collection protocols, and meticulous documentation. What they didn't have was the technology to read what that evidence was screaming. No CODIS database existed. It wouldn't launch until 1998, 16 years into Karen's case. No way to cross-reference DNA profiles nationally. No genetic genealogy techniques to trace family trees through biological material. The evidence sat in storage like a book written in a language no one could yet read. Investigators could photograph blood patterns, collect samples, preserve autopsy slides with sperm cells from the sexual assault, but they couldn't extract meaning from any of it beyond basic blood typing. Computer databases for cross-referencing suspects were primitive at best. Checking if someone had a criminal history in another county required phone calls, written requests, and weeks of waiting. If Gary Ramirez had committed similar crimes in Fresno, 160 miles away, Sunnyvale investigators would have had no efficient way to discover the pattern. Each jurisdiction operated in relative isolation. Information traveling at the speed of mail and interdepartmental cooperation rather than the speed of keystrokes. The Sunnyvale team worked the case hard. They collected everything. They documented everything. They preserved everything with care that would prove crucial decades later. But in 1982, they were investigators fighting with Stone Age tools against a predator who understood that time and distance would protect him. In the critical first 72 hours, when most homicides are solved, when witnesses remember best, when evidence is freshest, investigators focused intensely on Karen's 17-year-old boyfriend. The logic made sense. He was the last person to see her alive. He admitted leaving her alone at that bus stop. He had opportunity. Statistically, victims usually know their killers. Investigators spent hours interviewing him, re-interviewing him, checking his timeline, verifying his alibi, questioning his friends. They examined his relationship with Karen for signs of trouble, possessiveness, violence. They looked at him the way homicide investigators are trained to look at intimate partners, with suspicion rooted in decades of statistical probability. He wasn't their killer. DNA would eventually prove this definitively in the early 2000s, 20 years after the murder, 2 decades after suspicion had marked him. But those initial 72 hours spent focusing on him were 72 hours not spent on other possibilities. Not spent canvassing for the white panel truck more aggressively. Not spent considering that a predator from Fresno might hunt in Sunnyvale. Not spent understanding that this was random predation, not intimate partner violence. The assumption cost weeks of investigative momentum. By the time they conclusively cleared him through traditional methods, the trail had cooled. Witnesses had forgotten details. The white panel truck had disappeared. Gary Ramirez had returned to Fresno or moved on to wherever he moved next, invisible and free. The boyfriend carried another cost, too. Years of sideways glances, unspoken suspicion. The weight of being the person investigators looked at first and hardest. Even after being cleared, some people would always wonder. That's the toll of proximity and violent death. Suspicion becomes a stain that doesn't fully wash out. This wasn't a story of incompetence. This was worse. It was a story of competence rendered meaningless by technological limitations. Evidence error. 1. The blood on the wall. Investigators photographed and collected the blood on the cinder block wall behind Karen's body. They documented that it appeared to be a mixture. Victim's blood and possibly the killer's, given the violence of the attack and the probability of the assailant cutting himself during 59 stab wounds. They stored it properly in evidence. They did everything right. But in 1982, they could only determine basic blood type. The blood sample sat in storage for 18 years, through the rest of the 1980s, through the entire 1990s, before DNA technology advanced enough in 2000 to create a usable profile. 18 years. By then, Gary Ramirez had been living free for nearly 2 decades, his DNA profile created but matching nothing in any database because he'd never been arrested, never been fingerprinted, never entered the system that might have caught him. Evidence error Shus 2. The autopsy slides. The medical examiner preserved vaginal slides containing sperm cells from the sexual assault. Standard protocol, proper preservation, everything documented. But extracting DNA from sperm cells in 1982 was impossible. The slides sat in storage alongside the blood sample, containing the answer to who killed Karen Stitt in molecular code that couldn't be deciphered. When technology finally advanced enough to extract and analyze that DNA, it matched the DNA from the blood on the wall, confirmation of single-source killer evidence. But by then, it was 2000, and Gary Ramirez had been free for 18 years. The evidence was perfect. The technology timeline was catastrophic. Evidence error number 3. The clothing. Karen's clothing, the striped shirt used to bind her wrists, the leather jacket tied around her ankle, the pants she wore, all contained blood and body fluids. All were collected, photographed, stored in paper bags to prevent moisture degradation, handled with care that would make modern forensic technicians proud. All completely useless for 18 years. The fluids contained DNA. The DNA could identify the killer, but the technology to read that DNA wouldn't exist until the 2000s. So the clothing sat in an evidence box in a Sunnyvale storage room, molecules holding secrets in silence, waiting for science to catch up to necessity. Gary Ramirez was never on anyone's radar, not in 1982, not in 1990, not in 2000 when the DNA profile was finally created, not until 2021, 39 years after the murder, when an anonymous tip mentioned the Ramirez family name from Fresno. He had no criminal record that would put him in investigative databases. He had no connection to Karen Stitt, no mutual friends, no workplace overlap, no school connection. Nothing that would cause investigators to look at him. He lived in Fresno, 160 miles away, far enough to not be an obvious suspect, but close enough to make a late-night drive to Sunnyvale completely feasible. The machinist witness saw the white panel truck, old-fashioned design, stripe along the side, rectangular bumper sticker, parking lights on, parked near where Karen's body was found. He reported it. Investigators documented it. But without a license plate number, without vehicle registration databases that could be efficiently searched, without any way to connect white panel truck in Sunnyvale to Gary Ramirez from Fresno, the observation became just another detail in a file folder. Ramirez was the perfect ghost. Present at the crime, his DNA mixed with Karen's blood on that wall, his sperm cells preserved on autopsy slides, but invisible to every investigative technique available in 1982. He could have walked past the investigation command post and no one would have recognized him. He could have driven that white panel truck through downtown Sunnyvale the next day and no one would have known to stop him. He wasn't overlooked because investigators were lazy or incompetent. He was overlooked because he existed outside every system designed to catch killers. No database contained him. No witness could identify him. No connection linked him to his victim. In 1982, he was uncatchable. This case had no institutional cover-up, no powerful person protecting the guilty, no authority figures ordering investigators to look away. The failure here was purely technological and temporal. The crime happened before the tools existed to solve it. In some ways, that makes it more frustrating. If someone had protected Ramirez, we could blame them. Instead, we can only blame timing, and timing doesn't take responsibility. Over 40 years, tips came in. Each one required investigation. Each one consumed resources. Each one led nowhere. The boyfriend theory absorbed weeks of intensive investigation, cleared eventually, but only after exhaustive work that diverted attention from other possibilities. Traditional detective work, interviews, timeline verification, relationship analysis, all pointed to his innocence, but proving innocence takes almost as much work as proving guilt. The white panel truck description generated dozens of tips. People called in about white trucks they'd seen, white trucks owned by neighbors, white trucks driven by suspicious-looking individuals. Each sighting required follow-up. Each vehicle required checking. None of them were Gary Ramirez's truck, because no one knew to look for Gary Ramirez. Tips about suspicious men in the area that night. Tips about similar crimes in other jurisdictions. Tips from psychics, from concerned citizens, from people who'd had dreams about Karen. In a pre-digital era, each tip required manual processing. Interviews, written reports, cross-checking against known information. The Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety couldn't ignore any of them. Anyone might be the lead that broke the case. They all led to dead ends. Gary Ramirez never appeared in any of them because he'd returned to Fresno or moved on, leaving no trail, generating no tips, existing in perfect invisibility while investigators chased ghosts. One investigator, years later, reflected on the frustration. We knew we had evidence. We knew it contained the answer. But we couldn't read it. It's like having a map to buried treasure written in a language you don't speak. You know the answer is there. You just can't access it. If only DNA technology had existed in 1982. The blood on that wall held Gary Ramirez's DNA mixed with Karen Stitt's. A simple analysis would have generated a profile. That profile would have been unique to him. Even without a database match, it would have been preserved, waiting for the day he entered the system through arrest, military service, or any other means of collection. Instead, that blood sat useless for 18 years while Ramirez lived free. If only the machinist witness had gotten a license plate number. He saw the white panel truck. He noted it was unusual. He remembered the stripe, the bumper sticker, the parking lights. But he didn't write down the license plate. Why would he? It was just a truck parked in an odd spot, not yet connected to murder. If he'd jotted down those numbers, 1982 vehicle registration databases could have led investigators directly to the owner. One detail, 7 characters, 40 years of difference. If only genetic genealogy had been available earlier. The DNA profile was created in 2000, 20 years before it would be used to identify Ramirez. It sat in CODIS and other databases for 21 years, matching nothing because Ramirez had never been arrested. But genetic genealogy doesn't require the suspect to be in a criminal database. It traces family relationships through DNA. If that technique had existed in 2000 or 2005 or even 2010, investigators could have identified the Ramirez family line and narrowed suspects decades earlier. Instead, the technique wasn't applied until 2019, 37 years after the murder. 3 moments. 3 small shifts in timing or detail. Any one of them might have caught Gary Ramirez before he moved to Hawaii, before he aged into a senior citizen, before he spent 40 years breathing free air while Karen Stitt remained forever 15. Catherine Leszewski was in Pittsburgh when her daughter died in California. That geographic fact, 3,000 miles of continent separating mother from daughter, became the detail that defined her grief. Every morning, for 40 years, she woke to the same thought. If I had been there, if Karen had stayed in Pittsburgh, if I had insisted she come home instead of going to California with her father. The guilt of distance wasn't rational, but guilt rarely is. She carried it like a weight that never lightened, a constant pressure on her chest that no amount of reasoning could relieve. She kept Karen's Pittsburgh belongings in the bedroom Karen had occupied before the move west. Not as a shrine, she wasn't frozen in that way, but as evidence of the before. The clothes Karen wore in Pennsylvania winters, the school notebooks from Pittsburgh schools, the photographs of Pittsburgh friends. These items represented the daughter who hadn't yet boarded that westbound journey, the version of Karen who might still be alive if only the family had stayed together, stayed east, stayed in the familiar cold instead of chasing California sunshine. Every July 25th, Karen's birthday, Catherine marked not just her death but the life she would have lived. 16, 17, 21, 30, 40, 50. Each birthday, Catherine calculated what milestone Karen would be reaching. High school graduation, college, first job, marriage, maybe. Children, possibly. Each year, the list of things Karen would never do grew longer, while Karen herself remained forever 15. By the early 1990s, a decade into the waiting, Catherine's hair had gone completely gray. Friends attributed it to age, but she knew better. Stress accelerates everything, speeds the body's deterioration like time-lapse photography of decay. By the 2000s, when DNA technology finally created a profile that matched nothing in any database, resignation had settled into her bones alongside the grief. For 40 years, 14 sasus and 10 days, she lived knowing someone had murdered her daughter and walked free. That knowledge sat with her at breakfast, rode with her to work, lay beside her at night. The killer breathed. Karen didn't. That fundamental injustice colored everything. When news of Gary Ramirez's arrest reached her in August 2022, she was 70-plus years old. 40 years had passed. Karen would have been 55. The relief came mixed with reopened wounds. All that time lost, all those years stolen, not just from Karen but from everyone who loved her. Robert Stitt brought Karen to California. That decision, moving his children west, creating the circumstances that placed Karen on that bus route, in that city, at that bus stop, haunted him in ways different from, but equal to Catherine's distant guilt. He lived in Palo Alto, just 10 miles from where Karen's body was found in Sunnyvale. Geography made forgetting impossible. Every time he drove down El Camino Real, a major artery he couldn't avoid, he passed near the site. The Woolworth Garden Center, the bus stop, the retaining wall. These locations existed in his daily landscape, constant reminders that his daughter's last moments happened in places he could drive to in 15 minutes. For 40 years, he participated in the investigation whenever investigators needed family cooperation, provided information, answered questions, maintained contact with the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety. His commitment to the case wasn't dramatic. No obsessive basement investigation room, no solo searches, but it was steady. He never stopped being available, never stopped being Karen's father pursuing justice. The physical toll manifested quietly. The weight of living so close to the murder site. The knowledge that his decision to move to California had placed Karen in harm's way. The helplessness of watching years pass with no answers. By the 2000s, he was aging with the case, growing old alongside the evidence boxes that held his daughter's clothing and the blood that would eventually identify her killer. When the arrest came in 2022, Robert was in his 70s or 80s, old enough that 40 years represented more than half his adult life spent waiting. The relief must have felt like setting down a weight he'd carried so long his body had shaped itself around it. Suzanne Stitt was Karen's older sister, protective and close. When Karen died, Suzanne took on the role of memory keeper, the family member who wouldn't let Karen become just a case number, just a statistic, just a cold case mentioned in true crime discussions. Years after the murder, Suzanne made a decision about Karen's final resting place. She chose Mount Tamalpais in Mill Valley, California, a mountain with sweeping views of the Bay Area, a place of natural beauty that felt worthy of her little sister. She climbed that mountain and scattered Karen's ashes across its slopes, giving her sister a resting place with views that stretched for miles, where wind and weather would carry her into the landscape itself. That act, choosing beauty, choosing permanence, choosing a mountain, spoke to how Suzanne processed grief. She created meaning where violence had destroyed it. She gave Karen a place in California that wasn't defined by the retaining wall or the bus stop or the murder site. Karen's brother, name lost to documentation, lived with Karen and their father in Palo Alto. He was there in the immediate aftermath, there when police came to the door, there when the house transformed from home to crime scene periphery. His path through 40 years of grief remains undocumented. But he carried his own version of survivor's guilt, his own questions about whether he could have protected his little sister. Robin Stitt Morris became the spokesperson for Karen's family over the decades. She carried the case's memory through family gatherings, through years when media attention faded, through the long middle decades when the case was cold and seemingly unsolvable. Robin described the murder as leaving an indelible scar on our hearts, permanent damage that never fully healed. For 40 years that scar remained tender, easily reopened by anniversaries, by news coverage of similar crimes, by every reminder that Karen's killer walked free. When arrest came on August 2, 2022, Robin was absolutely floored. She later said, "40 years melted away, and the emotions that had been buried all came back. A wound was reopened. But somehow I felt relief and peace. And finally, with conviction secured, soon we will be able to write the end to this painful chapter of our lives." Years 1 to 2, 1982-1984. The Bay Area community mobilized. Volunteers searched. Media covered the case extensively. Local news, regional coverage, the story of a 15-year-old girl murdered waiting for a bus resonated beyond Sunnyvale. Reward funds were established. Vigils were held. The community believed the case would be solved quickly, that justice would be swift. Years 3 to 5, 1985, 1987. Media attention began fading. Anniversary articles appeared in local papers, but the daily coverage stopped. The investigation slowed as leads dried up. Community members who'd been deeply invested began moving on with their lives while Karen's family remained frozen. The case was becoming cold in the official sense, still open, still worked occasionally, but no longer priority. Years 10 plus, 1992 onward. Original investigators retired or moved to other cases. Karen became a file number more than a person in active investigation. The family learned to live with permanent absence and no answers. New Sunnyvale residents didn't know the story. Younger people who'd been children in 1982 were now adults with no memory of when it happened. Years 20 plus, 2002 onward. The DNA profile created in 2000 offered brief hope. Technological breakthrough, but led nowhere. No database matches. Resignation settled in that this might never be solved. Family members were aging with their grief. Robert and Catherine, who'd been parents of a teenager, were now senior citizens. Suzanne was middle-aged. The brother was middle-aged. Karen remained 15 forever, while everyone who loved her grew old without her. For 40 years, Karen's family lived in two timelines simultaneously. In one timeline, life moved forward. Careers progressed, other children grew up, decades accumulated. The world changed from 1982 technology to 2022 technology. In the other timeline, it was always September 3, 1982, always 10:45 a.m., always the moment a delivery driver saw what he saw at the base of that retaining wall. They existed in both timelines constantly, unable to fully inhabit either one. They couldn't fully move forward because the past remained unresolved. They couldn't stay in the past because life demanded participation. So they learned to exist in that liminal space. Functioning but fractured, living but not whole. Birthdays came and went. Holidays arrived and departed. The Stitt family set tables for Thanksgiving and Christmas with Karen's absence a presence at every gathering. An empty space where a daughter, sister, niece should have sat. A missing voice in family conversations. A ghost made of memory and grief, and the fundamental injustice of murder unpunished. For 1,410 days they waited. For 40 years they wondered if justice would ever come. And for all that time, Gary Ramirez lived in Hawaiian paradise, breathing ocean air, watching sunsets, existing in freedom while they existed in grief. If you believe families like Karen's deserve our attention and support, even decades later, please subscribe to Solved Cold Cases HQ and turn on notifications so you never miss these stories. Then, hit that like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how families survive decades of waiting for justice. Your engagement helps these important stories reach others who care. The Woolworth Garden Center where Karen's body was found closed in the late 1980s, then was demolished entirely, replaced by modern strip malls. The Honey Bee restaurant nearby vanished. El Camino Real transformed from 1982's mom-and-pop corridor into Silicon Valley's chain restaurant artery. Only Ponderosa Elementary remained, aging alongside the case. The Sunnyvale of 2022 was unrecognizable compared to September 1982. The physical world where Karen died had been paved over completely. Technology evolved dramatically. In 1982, rotary phones, typewriters, no computers in squad cars. By 2000, DNA testing advanced enough to create profiles from the blood on that wall and sperm cells from autopsy slides, 18 years after collection. But CODIS held limited profiles. Gary Ramirez wasn't among them. By 2010, familial DNA searching became standard, but wasn't yet applied to Karen's case. Original 1982 investigators retired. Some died, taking institutional knowledge with them. Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety saw multiple administrations. Case ownership passed from detective to detective. Each reviewed files, found same dead ends, added notes to thousands of pages leading nowhere. In 2017, Detective Matthew Hutchison inherited the case, treating 40-year-old evidence as if collected yesterday. 2000, DNA profile created from 1982 evidence. Blood on wall revealed mixed DNA, Karen's and male DNA. Autopsy slides confirmed matching male profile. Perfect evidence, submitted to CODIS. No match. Gary Ramirez had never been arrested, never entered any database. Hope raised, then crushed. Early 2000s, DNA cleared Karen's boyfriend definitively, after 20 years under suspicion. But clearing him left no alternative suspects, no leads, just a profile matching no one. 2019, Hutchison began collaborating with genetic genealogy expert, revolutionary technique using family relationships through public databases rather than requiring suspects' profile. This was the tool that didn't exist for 37 years. Karen's case became Bay Area legend. That girl at the bus stop, the cautionary tale about traveling alone. For the community, the case softened into history. For the Stitt family, 40 years felt like 14,610 individual days of waiting. Case Yerk 82, 10458 sat on evidence storage shelves in cardboard boxes. Clothing, blood vials, autopsy slides, photographs. Labels faded from black on white to gray on yellow. Newer cases accumulated around it. Resignation settled like dust. The living needed resources more than the dead needed justice, or so limited budgets suggested. Except for Karen's family, for whom it was always September 3rd, 1982. Always 10:45 a.m. Always the moment everything stopped. 2021. 39 years after Karen Stitt was murdered at a bus stop on El Camino Real. Detective Matthew Hutchison received an anonymous tip, vague, barely more than a whisper, suggesting a male member of the Ramirez family from Fresno might be involved in an old case. No specifics, no evidence, just a surname and a city 160 miles away. Most detectives might have filed it away, added it to the thousands of dead-end tips accumulated over 4 decades. But Hutchison had taken ownership of Karen's case in 2017 with the specific stubbornness required for cold casework. Since 2019, he'd been collaborating with an investigative genetic genealogy expert, waiting for the right thread to pull. This tip gave him that thread, Ramirez, Fresno, a family name to trace. Hutchison started with U.S. Census records, the mundane bureaucratic documentation that tracks American families across decades. The Ramirez family appeared in Fresno records dating back to at least 1950, established California residents, not transients. Fresno sat approximately 160 miles from Sunnyvale. In 1982, that distance represented about a 2.5-hour drive on Highway 99 or Interstate 5. Far enough to not be obvious suspects, investigators in 1982 had focused on local residents, people with direct connections to Karen or the Sunnyvale area, but close enough to make a late-night drive completely feasible. Someone could leave Fresno in the evening, arrive in Sunnyvale by midnight, commit murder, and return home before dawn. The geographic window opened. The Ramirez family had been in California, in range, during September 1982. Using public databases and social media platforms that didn't exist in 1982, Facebook, Instagram, genealogy websites, public records aggregators, investigators identified 4 Ramirez brothers from that Fresno family who were living males of appropriate age range for the 1982 crime. Social media became an investigative goldmine. Family photos posted decades later revealed relationships. Location tags showed where family members lived now. Friend lists and tagged photos created a map of the Ramirez family tree that would have required months of traditional investigation to construct in the 1980s. In 2021, it took days. Within 2 weeks, investigators had identified all 4 brothers, their current locations, their approximate ages, their family structures. 2 of the 4 brothers were conclusively ruled out through various investigative means. Specific details not publicly documented, but likely involving age verification, geographic impossibility, or other exclusionary factors. A 3rd brother could not be definitively excluded, but ranked lower in probability. That left Gary Gene Ramirez as the primary person of interest. He was the right age, approximately 35 in 1982. He'd been living in California. He had no documented alibi for September through 1982, though establishing alibis for a specific night 40 years earlier is virtually impossible. Gary Ramirez moved to the top of a list that hadn't existed 2 months earlier. In early March 2022, Detective Hutchison identified Gary Ramirez's daughter through social media, cross-referencing, and public records. She was living in Southern California, Orange County or Los Angeles area, specific location not publicly disclosed, living her life, sharing photos, posting updates, completely unaware that her family tree held a 40-year-old secret. She had no involvement in her father's 1982 crime. She was innocent, but her DNA held the key to confirming his guilt. Her social media presence, the mundane digital sharing that billions of people engage in daily, provided investigators with current location, daily routines, and enough information to conduct legal surveillance. April 8, 2022. Investigators conducted surveillance on Gary Ramirez's daughter at her Southern California residence. They waited until trash collection day. When she placed her household garbage on the curb for pickup, investigators legally obtained items from that trash. This is crucial. Trash placed on public curbs for collection has no expectation of privacy under U.S. law. What you throw away, you've abandoned. Law enforcement can legally collect and analyze it without warrants. One person's discarded garbage, tissues, food containers, personal items containing biological material, became another person's evidence. From that trash, investigators extracted DNA samples. The daughter had unknowingly provided the genetic key to her father's identification. Within days, samples were transported to forensic laboratory for analysis. The forensic lab compared the daughter's DNA to the male DNA profile created in 2000 from Karen Stitt's crime scene, specifically the blood on the cinder block retaining wall, mixed with Karen's blood, and the sperm cells preserved from 1982 autopsy vaginal slides. Nuclear DNA analysis, using autosomal markers, established a familial relationship between the daughter and the crime scene DNA source. The lab reported high probability and very strong statistical support that Gary Gene Ramirez was the biological source of the male DNA found at the crime scene. Statistical probability. The daughter's DNA showed genetic markers consistent with being the offspring of the crime scene DNA contributor. Random probability that someone unrelated could share those markers at that level. Astronomically low, likely in the range of 1 in billions or trillions, though exact figures aren't publicly documented. This wasn't direct DNA match. Gary Ramirez himself hadn't provided DNA, but familial DNA analysis through his daughter created statistical certainty sufficient for arrest warrant. The genetic genealogy technique that didn't exist until recent years had finally read the molecular message written in blood on that wall 40 years earlier. Lead analyst's assessment, paraphrased from Investigative Standard. The probability that the crime scene DNA came from someone other than the daughter's father was statistically negligible. Combined with other corroborating factors, this constituted probable cause. Cross-referencing Gary Ramirez's documented location history confirmed he was living in California in 1982, within driving distance of Sunnyvale. The machinist witness's description of the white panel truck, old-fashioned design, stripe alongside, rectangular bumper sticker, parking lights on, couldn't be definitively linked to Ramirez's vehicle ownership 40 years later. Vehicle records from 1982 were incomplete, and Ramirez likely no longer owned that truck, but the geographic and temporal alignment fit perfectly. Ramirez had opportunity. He was in California, in range, with no documented alibi. He had means, adult male, physically capable. The only missing element had been identification, and DNA through his daughter had now provided that. The evidence pointed to someone who had no connection to Karen Stitt. Not a neighbor, not a family friend, not someone from her school or her father's workplace or her boyfriend's social circle. Someone who saw an opportunity in the dark. A 15-year-old girl standing alone at a bus stop after midnight on a commercial corridor that had emptied out for the night. Someone who took that opportunity with extreme violence. 59 stab wounds, sexual assault, binding her with her own clothing. Someone who then disappeared back into his regular life, leaving Karen's body hidden at the base of a retaining wall 100 yards from where she'd stood waiting for the number 22 bus. Someone who had never been on investigators' radar in 1982 or 1990 or 2000 or even 2010. Someone who existed outside every database, every witness statement, every investigative lead pursued over 40 years. Someone who had moved to Paradise and aged into a senior citizen while Karen's family aged with their grief. Gary Gene Ramirez. Born around 1947 in California. Raised in Fresno, one of 4 brothers. In 1982, he was approximately 35 years old. Old enough to have vehicle, mobility, independence. Old enough to be a predator hunting young girls on empty streets after midnight. By August 2022, when investigators identified him through his daughter's DNA, Gary Ramirez was 75 years old, living in Makawao on the island of Maui, Hawaii. He'd been living in tropical paradise for years. Exact time frame of Hawaii residency not publicly documented, but clearly long-term. He breathed salt air, he watched Pacific sunsets. He lived in one of the most beautiful places on Earth while Karen Stitt remained forever 15, her ashes scattered over Mount Tamalpais by a sister who chose beauty for her final resting place. Ramirez had no known connection to Karen. This wasn't intimate partner violence. This wasn't revenge or robbery or any crime with a logical motive. This was predatory opportunism. He saw a vulnerable target and attacked. The horror isn't just in the violence, it's in the randomness. Karen did everything right. She followed bus schedules, she knew her routes, she trusted the system, and a stranger destroyed her anyway. For 40 years, Ramirez lived freely. He relocated to Hawaii, whether immediately after the crime or years later, sources don't specify, and built a life. He had at least one daughter. He aged from 35 to 75. He existed in complete freedom while Karen's family existed in frozen grief. He never confessed. He never showed remorse. He never turned himself in, even as decades passed and he aged into senior citizenship. He simply lived, apparently believing that time and distance and lack of DNA databases in 1982 had protected him permanently. When Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety and Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office announced Gary Ramirez's arrest on August 2, 2022, 40 years of waiting collapsed into a single moment. Aunt Robin Stitt Morris, who had become the family spokesperson over 4 decades, was absolutely floored. She later said, 40 years melted away, and the emotions that had been buried all came back. A wound was reopened, but somehow I felt relief and peace. The Bay Area community, many of whose members had no memory of the 1982 murder, reacted with shock that a case so old could still be solved. Younger residents learned Karen's story for the first time. Older residents who remembered September 1982 felt vindication mixed with sorrow, justice finally, but 40 years too late. The breakthrough had come from trash, from social media, from genetic genealogy techniques that didn't exist for 37 years after the murder, from Detective Hutchison's refusal to let time bury the truth, from Karen's DNA mixed with her killer's on a cinder block wall, preserved by investigators who did everything right in 1982, even though technology wouldn't catch up for decades. Justice was coming. Slowly, finally. After 14,110 days of waiting. After identifying Gary Ramirez through his daughter's DNA in April 2022, investigators built a prosecutable case from evidence collected 40 years earlier. The boyfriend, now approximately 57 years old, originally interviewed extensively in September 1982, he maintained consistent account. He walked Karen to the bus stop around 12:30 a.m., then left her alone to catch the number 22 bus. He told investigators, "I felt bad about leaving her alone at the bus stop, but I didn't want to get in trouble with my parents for being home late." DNA definitively cleared him in the early 2000s, confirming what he'd maintained for 20 years. But guilt remained. He was the person who left her alone in the dark. His account established critical timeline. Karen was alive at 12:30 a.m. at that bus stop. The machinist witness, now likely in his 70s or 80s, working late shift in 1982, he noticed an unusual white panel truck parked near where Karen's body would be found. Old-fashioned design, distinctive stripe, rectangular bumper sticker, parking lights on. Without a license plate number, the observation led nowhere in 1982. In 2022, the detail became corroborating evidence. Someone was there, in a vehicle, during the critical time frame. The truck couldn't be definitively linked to Ramirez 4 decades later, but the observation supported opportunity. Original, 1982. Investigators. They collected evidence with meticulous care that proved crucial 40 years later. Blood from the wall. Vaginal slides from autopsy. Clothing stored in paper bags to prevent degradation. As Detective Matthew Hutchison noted, "I was able to still test blood and clothing and different things and get DNA on them 40-plus years after the crime, because the investigators collected them. They didn't know DNA fingerprinting would exist 2 years later, or genetic genealogy 37 years later. They simply did their jobs properly, making justice possible in 2022. 1982 crime scene reports. Detailed documentation of evidence locations, collection methods, chain of custody, photographs of blood on wall, body position, binding methods, autopsy reports noting 59 stab wounds, witness statements establishing timeline, modern genetic genealogy reports, census records documenting Ramirez family in Fresno since 1950, public databases identifying 4 Ramirez brothers, social media locating Gary Ramirez's daughter, surveillance documentation of trash collection April 8, 2022, laboratory analysis reports, DNA profile created in 2000 from blood and autopsy slides, familial DNA comparison in 2022 between crime scene profile and daughter's DNA, statistical analysis indicating high probability and very strong statistical support that Gary Ramirez was the source, probability likely in billions to 1 range. Evidence. Matrix, 4 categories of proof. Physical evidence, DNA from blood on wall, mixed profile, Karen's and male DNA matching familial relationship to Ramirez's daughter DNA from autopsy slides, sperm cells from 1982, assault, profile matched blood sample Karen's clothing, shirt used to bind wrists, jacket tied around ankle, both yielding DNA evidence crime scene photos. Documented 59 stab wounds, binding methods, violent attack, documentary evidence, 1982, investigation files, chain of custody for 40-year evidence preservation census, Hush public records, Ramirez family in Fresno since 1950, Gary approximately 35 in 1982, genetic genealogy research, anonymous tip to daughter identification process, documented lab reports, DNA analysis methodology and statistical probability. Testimonial. Evidence. Boyfriend. Placed. Karen alive at 12:30 a.m., alone when he left machinist. White panel truck near scene during critical time frame delivery driver. Discovered body. 10:45 a.m. Contacted authorities. Forensic experts, DNA methodology, familial matching probability, original investigators, evidence collection, preservation, chain of custody, circumstantial evidence, geographic proximity, Fresno, 160 miles from Sunnyvale, close enough for night trip. No connection to victim, random predatory attack theory. No alibi, impossible to establish 40 years later, relocation to Hawaii. Geographic distancing from California. No criminal record, never in databases, invisible to traditional methods. Individually, each category was substantial. DNA evidence alone established scientific certainty. Together, they formed overwhelming proof. As District Attorney Jeff Rosen stated, her murder was solved by forensic science, a remarkably stubborn detective and a determined prosecutor. The case, built across 40 years, proved that time doesn't erase truth when evidence is preserved and investigators refuse to surrender. August 2, 2022. Makawao, Maui, Hawaii. Morning trade winds. Tropical air, perfect island weather. After months of coordination between Santa Clara County authorities, Maui law enforcement and federal agencies, officers approached Gary Ramirez's residence. He was 75 years old, living in Hawaiian paradise for years, perhaps decades, while Karen Stitt's family endured 40 years of California grief. Gary Gene Ramirez answered the door. 40 years had transformed him from 35 to 75. Hair gray, face lined, body aged, but DNA doesn't age. The blood on that Sunnyvale wall, the sperm cells from the assault, the genetic markers passed to his daughter, all pointed to this elderly man as the killer. Gary Gene Ramirez, you're under arrest for the murder of Karen Stitt. His response isn't documented, but one can imagine the calculation. 40 years of freedom ending in handcuffs. The belief that time and distance had protected him, shattered by his daughter's discarded trash. No statement, no confession, just silence. August 10, 2022, 8 days later, Ramirez appeared in Maui court and agreed not to fight extradition to California. The practical choice. Resistance would only delay the inevitable. He was transported to Santa Clara County for arraignment. Specific details aren't publicly documented, but investigators likely presented evidence methodically. DNA matching his daughter with statistical certainty, crime scene evidence preserved 40 years, geographic proximity establishing opportunity. How do you explain your DNA at the crime scene? Where were you September 2, 1982? Why did you kill her? Gary Ramirez did not confess, even faced with incontrovertible DNA evidence, even after 40 years. Even at 75, he maintained silence or denial, specific details undocumented, but outcome clear. His silence speaks volumes. Calculation over emotion, self-preservation over accountability, the same emptiness that allowed 59 stab wounds and 4 decades of freedom. Modern forensic science made his cooperation irrelevant. Prosecutors had DNA matching his daughter, billions to 1 probability, sexual assault evidence, crime scene documentation, geographic opportunity, and no victim connection proving random predation. The evidence told the story without his words. Detective Matthew Hutchison reflected, "They're going to haunt me. There's just no way around that. They get into your soul, and these cases will affect me for the rest of my life. And it was all of us. It's not just me. I was able to still test blood and clothing and different things and get DNA on them 40-plus years after the crime because the investigators collected them." 40 years after Karen Stitt was murdered, her killer faced justice. Not because he confessed, but because science caught up and investigators refused to let time bury truth. February 24, 2025. No traditional trial. Santa Clara County Superior Court. No jury, no dramatic courtroom battle, no cross-examination of witnesses. Gary Jean Ramirez, now 78 years old, pleaded no contest to first-degree murder. 42 years, 5 months, and 21 days after killing Karen Stitt. A no-contest plea accepts legal consequences without admitting factual guilt. For the court, it functions as guilty. For Ramirez, it preserved psychological distance from full admission. He would be punished without ever saying, "I killed her." Karen's family watched. Aunt Robin Stitt Morris, possibly Sister Suzanne, others who'd carried grief since 1982. They'd waited 42 years for this moment. Ramirez wasn't charged with sexual assault despite forensic evidence of rape. Sperm cells from autopsy, DNA matching familial profile. This prosecutorial decision likely reflected statute of limitations issues, evidentiary complexity, and strategic focus on the strongest charge carrying a life sentence potential. Karen's rape was documented, acknowledged, part of the record. But the legal charge was murder. One count. Life sentence. May 12, 2025. Sentencing hearing. 3 months later, the court convened for sentencing. Karen's family addressed the court in victim impact statements. Specific quotes aren't documented, but they spoke about the indelible scar on our hearts that never healed 42 years of waiting, wondering Karen as a vibrant soul whose life was stolen. Milestones she never reached. She would have been 57. Relief mixed with reopened wounds. Gary Ramirez's statement isn't documented. He likely remained silent or made minimal statement through counsel. Even at sentencing, no remorse, no explanation, no acknowledgement of Karen as human. The judge imposed maximum sentence. Life in prison with possibility of parole after 25 years. Gary Ramirez, 78 at sentencing, will be eligible for parole at age 103. A mathematical possibility. A practical life sentence. Taken from Hawaiian retirement to California state prison. From 42 years of freedom to incarceration for whatever time remains. District Attorney Jeff Rosen, February 24, 2025. Today, I am thinking of a young woman whose life and future were torn from her. Karen Stitt would have been 57 years old today. Her murder was solved by forensic science, a remarkably stubborn detective and a determined prosecutor. The prosecution team. Assistant Deputy District Attorney Mark Buller, Investigator Michael Brown, Detective Joe Lockwood, Lead Investigator Detective Matthew Hutchison, delivered justice 42 years late, but undeniably delivered. Gary Jean Ramirez, age 78, led away in handcuffs. The same hands that stabbed Karen 59 times in 1982 now aged and restrained. The man who left her body at a retaining wall and drove into 40 years of freedom would die in prison. Not because he confessed, not because he showed remorse, but because science caught up and investigators refused to accept that time could bury truth. Karen Stitt waited 42 years. Her family waited 42 years. Justice came slowly, imperfectly, a no-contest plea rather than admission, legal resolution rather than moral accountability. But it came. Justice took 42 years, but it came. Subscribe to Solved Cold Cases HQ for stories where persistence wins against time. Like this video if you believe cold cases deserve this dedication. Share with true crime followers who care about justice delayed but not denied. Comment, do no contest pleas provide real closure? Your engagement helps these stories reach thousands more. The no contest plea came February 24, 2025, 42 years, 5 months, and 21 days after Karen Stitt was murdered. For Aunt Robin Stitt Morris, guilty brought complex relief. 40 years melted away, and the emotions that had been buried all came back. A wound was reopened, but somehow I felt relief and peace. And soon we will be able to write the end to this painful chapter of our lives. Not closure, but an ending. Parents Robert Stitt and Catherine Leszewski. Current status undocumented. If they were in their 30s or 40s in 1982, they'd be in their 80s or 90s now, if alive. The 43-year gap suggests at least one parent may have died without seeing justice. Sister Suzanne. Now, in her 60s, she scattered Karen's ashes over Mount Tamalpais, choosing beauty for her little sister. She witnessed resolution in 2025. Her 15-year-old sister's killer, now 78, finally held accountable. Brother, name undocumented, in his 60s now. Lived with Karen and their father, witnessed immediate family devastation, carries his own survivor's guilt. Aunt Robin Stitt Morris. Became family spokesperson over 4 decades. Her quotes documented the family's voice. Grief persisting alongside relief, pain coexisting with justice. No laws named after Karen, no foundation established. But her case contributed to validation of investigative genetic genealogy as viable cold case tool demonstration that 40-plus-year-old cases can be solved with proper evidence preservation, justification for meticulous evidence collection, even when immediate technology can't use it. U.S. Justice Department. Cold Case Grant Funding Validation District Attorney Jeff Rosen. Her murder was solved by forensic science, a remarkably stubborn detective and a determined prosecutor. No memorial service documented post-conviction. Woolworth Garden Center demolished. Bus stop unmarked. Karen's case became Bay Area proof that genetic genealogy works across decades. Gary Ramirez, incarcerated in California State Prison, facility undocumented. Age 78. Life with parole eligibility at age 103, a practical life sentence. No appeals, no statements, no remorse expressed. Karen's memory would be 57 or 58 today. Family imagines the life she'd have lived. Graduation, career, marriage, children, grandchildren, all erased September 3, 1982. Her ashes rest on Mount Tamalpais, scattered by Suzanne. Her story lives through family cooperation, forensic genealogy discussions, public memory as the girl at the bus stop. Time does not erase truth. For 42 years, justice seemed impossible. But Karen's family never stopped remembering. The 1982 investigators preserved evidence carefully. Detective Hutchison refused to accept that time could bury truth. When genetic genealogy became viable, when the tip came, when the daughter's DNA was obtained, everything changed. Lesson: persistence matters. Evidence preservation matters. Stubborn detectives matter. Truth waits longer than lies. Mount Tamalpais rises above the Bay Area, slopes covered in golden grass and dark evergreens. Somewhere on those slopes, carried by wind, are Karen Stitt's ashes. Scattered by Suzanne, chosen for beauty, placed where views stretch for miles. Karen never saw her 16th birthday, never built the California life she was beginning. She remains forever 15, but she outlasted her killer's freedom. She outlasted 42 years of silence. Justice came slowly. Memory persisted. And the truth, patient as mountains, waited exactly as long as it needed to. Thank you for witnessing Karen Stitt's story. Subscribe to Solved Cold Cases HQ and turn on notifications for more cases where justice prevails. Like to show these stories matter. Share to honor Karen's memory. Comment, what cold case should we cover next? We never stop seeking truth for the missing and murdered. Thank you for bearing witness.